Hello, everybody. Dara here, and welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited for this episode. This week, I have Peter Kelly here in front of me, another Irishman doing wonderful work in the world. I'm really fascinated for this conversation. He explores many different topics that I'm not so versed in, but I've kind of dabbled in and out of over the years. So to give you a little bit of an introduction to Peter, Peter is a Hermetic practitioner, philosopher, and mystic who guides others into awakening to their true nature through ancient wisdom and symbolic understanding. Author of 2 books, The Phoenix Birth and The Saturated Breath, he has transformed his own life from addiction and depression, anxiety to spirituality. Peter now teaches the timeless principles of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, theurgy, and the mystery schools. Through his books, courses, and initiatory teachings, he empowers others to navigate the subconscious, embody divine truth, and align with the evolutionary path of human consciousness. Peter, welcome to the episode.
Thank you, Dara. Thanks for having us. Always good to converse these topics in the times that we're in as well, and bounce across from the different approaches that we have. So really appreciate you having us on. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely, Peter. I've been following your work the last number of years, and I love this work of the subconscious mind, initiations, and the mystery schools. You know, my background as a scientist, I kind of had a very kind of aversion to mysticism and magic and spirituality and shamanism and all these topics. And then I kind of did a bit of a 180 at one point in my life where I was kind of like, wow, there's actually so much wisdom and knowledge here. And then I've kind of been on this path of trying to deeply understand these topics and how to apply them to my life, the people I work with. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your own journey. What was kind of like the point of entry for you into this world?
Yes, it's interesting because obviously we're always kind of changing the narrative of the story as we go further in the work. But I mean, the wisdom itself, I kind of was always into it, even since I was a child. About 5 or 6, I had this interest in ancient Egypt. And, I suppose I've studied it my entire life, but I mean, study is a strong word. When you go back to that age of 5 or 6, it was just more of an interest, we'll say. And so that was always there, we'll say, that I always had that interest of always studying these modalities, going into like alchemy and different things. But I suppose coming to the deep work was just a life of misery, I suppose. Like I think like with most people, that catalyst is the suffering. I had a pretty heavy, dark life. I was in, a lot of dark places through the addiction. I was in prison, a couple of times. I've been in rehab. I've been all those places. And just coming to about my mid-30s is where I kind of came to plant medicine. I kind of got to that stage where kind of things were just really highlighted, where I couldn't avoid. I kind of gotten through most of my addictions myself, we'll say, but I was just left with the lingering habits, I suppose, of why I was going to those addictions, what I was, I suppose, trying to mask. And so, yeah, just, I suppose, a path of suffering is the best way I describe it, that kind of got me to looking for something to change. And that was plant medicine. It was ayahuasca, actually, was the first thing. And, that was, as I said, about maybe 34, 35, something like that. And it just gave me a scratch of the surface, I think, for the first time, where, diving into it, I suppose, once I felt that I got a bit of weight off my shoulders, it was like, okay, this is the thing for me. Because I just, was one of these people who just presumed, whatever, I was dealt a bad hand, and that's just the way it's going to be, we'll say. That, no mastery over my own life, just kind of accepting things as they were. And that gave me this perception to kind of change the half, I suppose, the glass half empty to the glass half full. And that was the start of it. The next thing, everything just started to unveil about the reconnecting, I suppose, of this wisdom I'd been studying, and what that took me into myself as well. So, I mean, beautiful, as we know, these journeys are always beautiful once we kind of commit to them, but it was, the difficulty was what brought me there in the beginning, definitely.
Yeah, I love that. Kind of very similar to my own journey, getting to a point when the suffering's almost too much. It's like, shit, I need to do something. And, some people don't do anything with that for the rest of their life. They live in misery, they live in suffering. And then, like, we know through this work that they end up getting disease and having, all sorts of mental health issues. But it sounds like you really took responsibility for your life again.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of things, like there was a lot of stages like throughout the journey. I mean, the birth of my daughter was one big part for me, which was I mean, I was out of prison, I think about 2 years at that time, and my daughter was born. And like that was kind of almost, it solidified for me at that point, even though I was kind of coming off a lot of the well, in particular drugs at that time. I was still pretty hooked on the alcohol a little bit. But at that time, it was kind of almost this conscious marker in life that kind of said, well,
Mm,
now there's something else, that there's someone else that you're responsible for. So it's no longer just about me being reckless in myself. It's like there's other parties involved here now that kind of something has to change. So, I mean, the birth of my daughter was a big marker for me in kind of solidifying the fact of not being able to go back anymore.
yeah.
Sometimes I think it's helpful to put our strength in something else at times when we need the strength for ourselves. I think, to use it that way. But she was definitely a big marker for me, like in making that change.
Mm. Yeah, I really feel that. It's, I want to talk about initiations and having a child. The woman goes from the maiden to the mother, and a lot of the time the boy into the father, and that's quite an initiation for
Yeah.
men if you can step up to it.
Yeah, yeah, and it is like I mean, it's such a big thing because, like, I mean, obviously, the first thing that's going to go through your head is all the fears from your own childhood of what whatever was the environments that we grew up in, whatever we received and didn't receive. Again, just through the lineage of ancestral wounds. So, it's a process in itself, and as you said, it really is that initiation because it is that stepping up into like, I suppose, true manhood, even if we're not fully in the balanced male even at that time. It forced us to start taking the steps to kind of do better and to I suppose take analysis on ourselves as well to see where we at and how I'm showing up versus how that's going to impact now on other life. So it is it is a big step, I think, for any parent, no matter who you are, is going to kind of attest to the changes that come into life and the way that we think differently and have to think about somebody else now rather than just ourselves, we'll say.
Mm. Yeah, totally. And I think in these kind of initiatory processes as well, we get reflected a lot back about ourselves. The if we're have wounds around our father, wounds around the mother, our inner child, these kind of big archetypal energies as well.
Mm.
We can learn so much when these big kind of transformational experience happen to us in our lives. I'd love for you to maybe touch on a little bit about initiation. What other kind of initiatory things have happened to you in your life to get you to where you are today?
Well, I suppose I mean, initiation, I suppose, is a word that we should open up, I think, a little bit, first of all, because right, okay, prepared for this now because we're going to go down a bit of a rabbit hole, I think. But
Go for it. I love it.
so everything is consciousness, right? Is the whole expression of what everything is. And again, we can use different language from different modalities or schools of thinking to approach things. But I like to term everything as consciousness, or in Hermeticism, we call it the all. It's everything. And so again, if you go into a Hermetic axiom, which everybody is familiar with, is as above, so below, it kind of different ways of opening that up consciously. But one aspect you can take is it's a fractal universe. It's a fractal of consciousness. So no matter what bandwidth of our mind frame that we project outwards and analyze, the same laws apply. And it could apply here as well. And it changes, we'll say. So that's why I call it fractal. And so that word initiation for me is a beautiful word. It's a beautiful term, but it's also applies at any fractal level that we focus on, I suppose. Like, for example, at the moment right now, the human collective is going through a collective initiation as we're moving into this whole new frequency of consciousness. But then, as I said, there's coming into fatherhood or motherhood. That's a form of initiation. You could say women with a moon cycle is initiation, and I suppose for me that there's many initiations as we look throughout the life. Anytime I suppose we remove one layer of shadow and convert it into light is a form of initiation in some fractal degree as well. And so for me, in the journey of the path, I suppose that I'm walking myself is known as a path towards master of wisdom in some of the ancient traditions, we'll say, which is like the initiations, we'll say, of the ancient mystery schools. And so those initiations I kind of I've gotten a lot more versed with, we'll say, because as I've been coming through my own inner path, we'll say, in the last few years in particular. Like as I said, I came to plant medicine was my first getting underneath all this stuff. I suppose that was the layering of the density of the wounds and the imbalances that I had in my system. And as I've kind of come through that, it's taken me a few years to really understand that there was initiations, I suppose, happening at those kind of more major degree levels, we'll say. And they're quite intense. So for me, those initiations, what they really are is is in the path of Master of Wisdom. There's 7 degrees of initiation, and they're taken over like very, very vast periods of time, we'll say. Now, there's something quite vast that you could open on this that I'm not going to go into too much because we could get completely lost. But each degree, I suppose, the way that you would describe it is these are degrees that take us into completely whole new levels of reality consciousness. Is the best way to describe it. Now, all consciousness exists in the one space, but again, our mind is only attuned to the level that it's attuned to. So it's like a bandwidth. We say that we're like an old radio that you can only tune to the bandwidth that's available to you, which means you're only picking up the information that's available in that. As we expand our consciousness, then we're receiving more information, alters our reality because we have to apply the new wisdom to assess and to make sense of the reality around us. But these initiations, I suppose, in this Master of Wisdom they're marked like 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree, 4th degree onwards, we'll say. Like they mark milestones, we'll say, in shifts in consciousness, which means that your resting consciousness becomes more attuned to these planes as we go up, we'll say, and higher, which means that you're kind of moving beyond matter. We all have a baseline consciousness of matter, the physical plane, but it's a very, very finite existence because obviously matter is finite. And once you start to kind of go beyond that, these initiations start to mark you in different degrees of completely whole new realities, basically. So you're stripping away levels of identity of yourself because obviously as more information comes in these new levels, you can no longer identify with things that you know are no longer who you are. Very hard to put into words, but these degrees mark very, very kind of profound shifts, we'll say, in consciousness in your baseline realities.
Wow. Yeah. Amazing. And I love that you kind of touched on, the kind of global initiation that we're going through. If I feel like nowadays there's a lot of people talking about, personal awakenings. I've had an awakening experience, and that means different things for kind of different people. But we're really kind of going through a bit of a global awakening right now. I feel, there's really terrible things happening in the world, genocides and famines and destruction of ecosystems, and the list goes on and on and on. But we're kind of being kind of really almost like forced into this kind of global initiation, and I think some of these characters out there are really playing the archetypal shadow characters, and I feel like that's potentially to kind of get us to the next level. What do you kind of see out there in the kind of the collective at the moment around this kind of global awakening?
Yeah, so I mean, I could take this so many different ways. I mean, again, if we can really open up the wisdom of the ascended masters, which is what they kind of guide through for the evolution of humanity, basically at all levels. Sometimes there's ascended masters communicating to people who are completely unconscious to it. And again, as you kind of expand and go forward, you kind of become more aware of what they're seeding, we'll say, for humanity's evolution. And like one thing is, the Western world is going through an initiation from 4th root race into 5th root race, which is a massive, massive shift, which is a cycle that lasts hundreds of millions of years, we'll say. And so the 4th root race in humanity is very material based. And we're actually coming out of that now as we're supposed to be kind of birthing into the 5th root race. Like the eastern side of the world are already kind of, well, obviously not everybody, of course, in any state of the world, but are already kind of breached into the 5th root race. So you would talk about like they'll have the Eastern masters that we were aware of, who still live a very, very spiritual, like in the Hindu, still live or they're born into this kind of a culture of spirituality, of knowing this wisdom, we'll say. But you see, us as Westerners, we're still very much stuck in the 4th root race. And so I'm going to jump all around the way here, by the way, just to give you a heads up. But when the masters first came through to the Western society, which was through the Theosophical Society and the founding of it back in like the mid 1800s, it was to start to seed the Western world, getting ready for this shift out of 4th root race into 5th root race. And like when you're talking about these kind of periods of time, these cycles of consciousness, they're so vast and so macro that the seeding can take a long, long time. Like you're talking about thousands of years, we'll say, in totality before we have a full shift. But obviously, of course, to make any shift, you have to have pioneers. So you can see, even if you come into a little bit more micro version, like how many people are coming to like spiritual based work or healing, plant medicines becoming more westernized. This is all part of consciousness evolving, getting us ready into this, moving into the 5th root race, which is a more spiritual based of humanity, basically. And so that is kind of what's happening. But what has to happen, as we know in the cycles of nature and consciousness, is, death is the symbolic death is a part of growth. There has to be a death in order to make way for the rebirth. And humanity is going through a death process at the moment. And the death process at the moment, how it's kind of showing up is we're being brought into a whole new frequency of consciousness for a start. So it's a higher frequency, which means that if it's a higher frequency, it means that we're now open to receive something at a new bandwidth. So this is actually revelation in biblical terms. And revelation is not a bad thing. Revelation is just a great revealing. And it's not a one-off event. It happens every time humanity goes through this shift. And we go through many different shifts throughout the cycles. There's many cycles in consciousness. So we're going through this period of revelation, so that we're becoming more, or what's becoming more revealed to us is the truth that has been hidden because of the lower vibration that we were living in. And as we see new truths, we have to adapt to it, because it's like taking in a new piece of information into the equation. It has to be applied to the equation. Otherwise, the result of the equation is not going to be balanced. And so we're going through this process, and the corruption that's being revealed, things are no longer hidden anymore. Those people that we're talking about, like, are playing out, I suppose, those shadow archetypes. You see, we have to understand their shadow is actually coming up through them. And I'm going to just go into a little bit of a side tangent there. Is, you see, this, I'm not trying to make a division here, but I'm going to make a division just to explain something. So obviously one of the sacred laws is polarity. So any wound that we have that we're out of balance in, we're either too much in it or we're not enough in it. And so, as we spoke about earlier on, like, the catalyst to this work is usually suffering. So let's just say the people who are suffering at that kind of a lower level are more on this negative side of the polarity. And so there's also people suffering at the other level, but they're suffering in a different way because they're on the opposite side of the polarity. And so let's just say the side that we're coming from in this suffering, of kind of low end suffering, because of what we didn't receive, we'll say, through the ancestral wounds, was because of struggle, that maybe our parents and ancestral lines went to something more, that low end of things for comfort and avoidance that we didn't receive. But you see, on the other side, you're having people who we've put into positions of power, who were probably raised in a little bit of a different environment, maybe through their parents, or maybe quite successful business people or politicians, which means they worked a lot. So they weren't present for those children. And so what happens is their shadow is now at the surface the same way ours is, because it's like a magnet when we go through these shifts. Everything gets pulled to the surface. And so we're here looking to save ourselves by changing our lives out of necessity to come out of the suffering. Whereas, you see, the people that we have put in power are just a shadow or a conscious representative of our own parents that we've put in there, because, again, we're all looking for saviors. But you see, the shadow that's moving through them is making them want to be seen by their parents. And so their parents chase money, wealth, power, and what have you. So they think, if I chase money, wealth, and power, my parents will finally respect me. They'll finally see me. And so we just have this divide that's happening. And of course, there's more chance that the people on the lower side are going to come to this healing work than the people on the other side. And I suppose one thing about that is, because money and success have a material base, we can kind of buy that distraction a little bit more and that comfort a little bit more. So again, it's not a judgment towards either side, but it's just an understanding. So, I mean, if you think about what's going on in the chaos of the world at the moment, it's an external reflection consciously of our inner collective makeup, we'll say. And so the external world is, I mean, the wars, the genocide, everything that's going on, I mean, it's all rooted back to matter. It's matter-based. It's money. It's, power, positions of power. These are all material-based, which is what we're moving out of the Fourth Root Race. So as much as it's a horrendous things that are happening out there in the world, it's really to understand that this is how consciousness shows up. At the individual level, my consciousness is going to show up in my individual field by what I attract in. You put a group of individuals together with a similar shadow, well, then we create a collective reality. And we are actually manifesting this collective reality. And that's why the work has to come back to the individual. I can only work on me. You can only work on you. I can't force the next person, as that famous quote is, you can take the horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. And you see, this is how consciousness actually operates, is we have a conscious field and it emanates outward. So basically anything that's in balance in my conscious field will only attract an imbalance. But anything that I have an imbalance in, either on the negative or the positive, because consciousness will always look to make balance, it will attract in the equal but opposite back into the field to make the balance. So we're highlighting the wound. And so that creates a paradox. When we try to fix externally, we just keep spinning, because we're trying to change something outside there. We're trying to get other people to change what we need to. So when we actually take that mirror back into ourselves and do the work on ourselves, we're creating balance in our system to attract imbalance. So I suppose for me, just in that level of what's going on in the outer world, it's literally just that showing up of that. And unfortunately, through the shadow of humanity, we kind of need to almost hit rock bottom, unfortunately, before we decide to make a change. And, not that I wish it, and of course I don't, but unfortunately, like the chaos out there is going to get worse and worse until people really decide to do something. But unfortunately, what can happen with that something is people will take it out externally to the street, to violence and things like that, which is, again, is just a projection of our inner anger and frustration out in the external world, which is, again, at a more collective scale is where we get wars. So it really is forcing us back into within ourselves to heal these wounds so that we can actually embrace this shift in consciousness that's actually available for us, and to take humanity into a place which is really available for us once we start to take responsibility and accountability on ourselves.
Wow, so beautifully put, Peter. And I think there's it brings up a lot for me. One of my biggest teachers, spiritual teachers, we Ram Dass, and he has the kind of famous saying, the greatest gift you can give to anybody else in your life is to work on yourself, because that just emanates and radiates out. And I think we're really in this moment in time now where people are waking up and starting to question the narratives and question power. And we live in a paradise. There is plenty of resources for everybody, yet there's still these kind of power games and struggles going on out there to dominate land and resources. And I love the way you kind of put it. It's like we're still looking for this kind of validation that we didn't get as children in the world, especially the people in power. Have you come across this idea of the Kali Yuga?
Yeah. I mean, like, I suppose when I talk about these conscious cycles, it's I mean, there's an infinite amount of conscious cycles at play, no matter what frame you want to focus on with your mind. Obviously, you can go down to the atom. You have conscious cycles in just the spin of electrons, protons, if you want to go to that level. But you also have what we consider time is a conscious cycle. It's just the Earth moves around the sun. And it's, no matter what level of fractal level you go to, you're just looking at cycles of consciousness. You can look at any planetary revolution. That there's archetypal energies that are associated to each one, and we are at the end of a Kali Yuga at the moment, and that's a 432,000 year cycle. Now, again, depending on who you talk to, they can have different variations on that. But not to get locked in, I suppose, the numbers, we'll say, or the surface level material based fixations, but like, we're at the end of a lot of major cycles at the moment. One of them being the 2,000 year cycle of, roughly 2,000 years of the 12 compartments of the great year, 26,000 years, where we're moving from the age of Pisces into Aquarius. So, I mean, if you think about the last time that happened, we had the Jesus, or Yeshua, came to kind of, when he evolved into the Christ, we'll say, because the teacher comes whenever there's a massive shift in humanity. Obviously, you go back 2,000 years ago, there was less population on the planet. But like, every time that humanity goes through a shift like what we're going through right now, somebody comes to seed the way that we're going to have to live in the new vibration, we'll say. Mm-hmm. And so like that happened 2,000 years ago. Jesus is the Fisher King, because the Pisces, you can go into quite deep into that anyway, but just as a kind of an idea. So we're here 2,000 years later. Now, I know I'm going to go a little bit sideways as I kind of hit this home, but people talk about the second coming of the Christ and they're waiting for Jesus to come back, we'll say. Well, for me, and my understanding is the awakening of the Christ is what's happening to everybody at the conscious level. Every individual person is awakening into that. So the second coming isn't so much of an individual, because there's too many people on the planet for a start, that we'd need something more vast to be able to reach. If one person came back now, they'd just be ridiculed and laughed out of it anyway, we'll say. And consciousness always will shift with the time, you see, because we are evolving with consciousness, because we're part of consciousness. So nothing will ever come back the same way, because we're not there. No man steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same man, not the same river, we'll say. Mm-hmm. So we have that cycle, which is a massive, massive shift for humanity that's happening. There's also many other cycles at play. We're also at the end of a Kali Yuga, which is, as we said, is, again, not to get fixated on the number, let's just say it's a 432,000 year cycle. So that's a huge, again, ending for a beginning. So these are all death processes that have to happen to relinquish the old to make way for the new. But then, as I was saying, we're also at this birthing, or the ending of the fourth root race, as we're starting to transition into the fifth root race. I mean, this is a cycle that lasts hundreds of millions of years. So if you can imagine these like sandwich cycles all coming down to this pinnacle, inverted apex, we'll say. And that's where we are right now in humanity. And that's why it is so difficult out there. But the other side of that, what I would look at is, if you've incarnated here at this particular time, it's a very, very important time to be here, because we're here to make a shift.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to bring forth our gifts, which is the individual gifts, not the conformity of what everybody else is doing. And everybody else is just doing what everybody else is doing out of fear, we'll say, really, if you go to the unconscious level. And that's why, we need pioneers. And pioneers is not, it's just about being who you are. And that's why, this work that we do is brings us back into removing those layers of the identities and the attachments and the associations that we have to feel safe, so that we can remove those and step into who we are. Because, true community is what we're heading into. It's the age of Aquarius, new technology, a whole new expression. And like, true community starts with the individual, and it has to, because if we just create community out of necessity, we're just creating shadow communities. And so community truly has to begin with the individual isolating, doing this work. I don't mean total isolation, but we have to separate ourselves from the commune of shadow that we've been involved in order to identify our own particular parts that we can work on. Once we begin to work on ourselves at our individual level and start to step into who it is that we are with our individual gifts, then natural community will start to form, because it will no longer be a community based on competition,
Mm-hmm.
because it won't be conformity. You'll be in your gifts, I'll be in mine, the next person in theirs, and each person supporting the next person to get into their gifts. Means that's when a natural, true, peaceful community can actually form. And that is where we are heading. And like, it is going to happen. That's the one thing, is the conscious cycles are written no matter what. We're just human. You can fight it all we want, but consciousness is consciousness. It's divinity itself. So it will happen, I suppose. But the difficult thing is, how much will we fight the change will create how much difficulty and chaos we're going to live in until the transit happens. So that's the only kind of part that I would see with the difficulty with it. And, obviously I can see the waves with this work. I see it pick up so much over the last few years, which I know you have yourself, like, and that really shows that that's the seeding, becoming a new collective. And you see, once the new collective is ready, the people who are fighting it, the reason that they're fighting is because it's fear, and we understand this, it is fear. But once there's enough people of a new collective creating a new island that can be stepped onto, that's when those people will have the courage to step over. So sometimes with this work being kind of pioneers, the people who will ridicule you and not understand you are the very people that you're also doing it for, because there is only one consciousness, really. But I do see it is happening. Like, these things are already written. It's just our time in how much we can actually engage it and to move it forward at the collective level.
No, nice, Peter. And I think it's, doing this work, it's just seeing everyone as a mirror and trying to have compassion for, we're all on the same journey at the end of the day. I heard something like, we just need 1% of the world population to wake up to make that full shift or change. It's like, if people keep working on themselves, it will just trickle out, and then the consciousness and awareness will be there. Well, it is already there, as you say.
Yeah.
And I love to hear that kind of, like, the flavor of hope through it, because I feel like in a lot of spiritual circles I'm in these days, there's quite a lot of doom and gloom. It's like the world is burning. There's so much devastation happen, and people are really struggling with feelings and emotions and injustices. And it's kind of like, wow, God, how do you stay optimistic in all of that?
Yeah, and it is like, it's obviously, this work is, you're dealing with your own individual shadow constantly. So like, it can, we can kind of get fixated on it a little bit too much as well, and it can come into the spaces. But for me, it's always good to kind of step in and step out of the macro levels. I know there for about 2 years ago, I was kind of worried. I was in a little bit of a case. I couldn't see the solution, basically. I can see what the expression of consciousness is, because I can see it, or where we have to be, but I couldn't see the pathway to it yet. And it's interesting, because I get information from everything. Absolutely everything is just speaking 24/7. And I just saw one Joe Rogan podcast with a guy on it. And it wasn't everything the guy was saying, because a lot of it didn't really match up to an alignment in consciously for me. But there was just something. There was just a little nugget that I got. And next thing, the whole pathway just kind of lit up. And like I said, I can see it now. I can see that the ideas and the thought processes that are necessary to necessarily be manifested into physicality, that are going to create the pathway for us, are started. They're being seeded already. And so that's why I was saying, like, I know where we're going to go, and it's going to happen. And I suppose that's comes back to the individual work, is like, it moves faster when everybody starts to take responsibility for themselves, and everybody, it's not about how much work you do. It's not a quantitative experience, as we know with this work. It's the qualitative experience. It's the level of the work that you do. It's not about rushing forward. It's just about, facing the piece that's in front of you right now, and moving through it as best you can. And I think once more people kind of come on board with that, which they will, because hard times push people for solutions. As we both see this in this work, a lot of people are coming to this work because they're looking for something better. They're looking for something to get away from that heaviness that's going on in the world. And that kind of jumps me back to this bit about the pioneers. Is that's why we're doing this work ahead, is because humanity is going to go through a very heavy death process, but it doesn't mean it has to affect us all. By doing this work, we kind of become a little bit bulletproof. You kind of step out of those pockets of consciousness that are still very much ingrained in shadow. And so the more of us that we step forward in this work, we're showing a way for other people, and they will come to it, and they will find something new that isn't in their reality, we'll say, at the moment. A lot of this stuff is considered woo-woo still to a lot of people, but like that will all get more malleable, and open up for more people to come forward. But I do see the beauty of it. I already see it. I see things in place already at the conscious level that are just waiting to be manifested into physicality. Once they start to exist in the higher planes, they just need to come down into physicality. So once they're seated there, like, I have no worries about it. And I mean, the one thing is that, look, is as much as it's terrible, some of the things that are out there, in which they are, we have to step back from it as well, because that will distract us from our own individual work, because we all have shadow that goes back. I mean, the human mind can't even comprehend how much shadow we actually carry, how many lineages, how many previous incarnations, that's deeply rooted. We think that we're acting out consciously up here, but 99% of what we do is still coming from our unconscious. And so these things trigger us. It makes us angry. And, while of course it's right to be angry about a lot of the things that are going on in the world, we have to be careful not to get pulled into the projective anger. Is I'm going to take my anger to that event. That anger that it brings up in me is giving me the ticket to deal with that anger in me, because that's coming from an injustice in all the previous incarnations in my ancestral lineage that has been before. But if I take it out there, that's not going to transmute it. I have to allow myself to get angry by what's happening out there, but get angry just through me, not projecting onto anybody else. That creates the clearance, that creates more empowerment. It's releasing the masculine energy back into its more balanced state, where we have the power, the drive, the willpower to step forward and do the right thing, which then, as everybody starts to do it, it becomes the collective again. Get that masculine taking back that role to protect the feminine, so the feminine gets in her full power. And then it's an onward cycle of beautiful unity, which we can actually move forward in. But I do see it happen. I see it, I mean, you see it yourself, you see it in the spaces, and it's there. And I've had to pinch myself sometimes as well, like where I've been in the heaviness of the darkness, and, because when we're in our own stuff, we get into the despair as well. But, then I step back and I just see that there's so many lights around this world. There's so many great things happening in small pockets of people just doing their own thing, of what feels right to them, and that's how it's going to shift. And it's already shifting. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I really feel like in the last number of years, more people are, getting to like meditation and yoga, and this is like the first entry point, and then they find themselves in shamanism or depth psychology or somatic work, and it's like, I think we're all moving kind of in that direction, and it's going to be it's going to be a slow, and it's going to be a process, and we can enjoy that as well. It's a big part of my work, trying to have a little bit of joy in these things too. But I love that idea of like almost I don't know if it was Carl Jung or someone else, about like withdrawing your projections from the world is like some of the biggest work you can do. Um, I spend a good bit of time researching and going to Buddhist kind of classes, and this idea of like, the monk is out on the water and he's peaceful and he's relaxing, and then another boat bumps off his boat, and he just fills up with anger, and he gets up and he's gonna like shout at this guy on the other boat, why did you bump into me? And then he looks over at the other boat and it's empty, there's nothing on the boat, and he's just with all of this anger, and it's his. It's like, he can't project that out onto somebody else out in the world. It's like, oh no, this is actually mine. I need to come to terms with it. I need to work through it. It's actually within. And for me, when I kind of heard that story, I was like, oh wow, it's like, yeah, it's all internal. It can be really all internal. And as well, yeah, I think what I see as well is like people get stuck in this kind of victim consciousness where they're kind of like pointing outwards. It's, oh, it's them. It's, it's them in my relationship. It's not me. It's they're causing the issues. They're causing the problems. Like pointing at the government, pointing at whatever it is, the media. It's like it's very much this kind of external thing. But you're so right. It's like how can we like disconnect from that and take that kind of radical responsibility for ourselves, how we're living our lives, how we're showing up, how we're living to our values and integrity, and then that kind of speaks volumes.
Yeah, yeah. There's a beautiful analogy that story. Actually, I really, really like it. But yeah, I mean that is it. It is when you realize that there is nobody else. There's only just you. There really is only just you. Everyone else is just, as you said, and like, in the planes of consciousness, as you start to kind of drift up through them, like especially through those initiations I've been talking about, like that's like it no longer be like you're no longer intellectualizing, because intellectualizing becomes a very material based consciousness, where we start to intellectualize things. But when you start to kind of move up in those degrees, it becomes reality. It becomes those shifts. And so it's no longer just something that we talk about, but it just becomes, you can't even operate any other way, because it isn't another way. You're not going away. And you do start to realize that it is just a unity consciousness, even though you're not even fully at the unity consciousness, we'll say, in its entirety yet. But, you start to kind of really, to see that. And again, if we go into Hermeticism here, just talk about the law of polarity. I mean, that is what it is if something feels off in my system, if something feels out of balance, whether it's conflict in a relationship or outside or, whatever it might be. Well, if there's something out of center in me, I'm attracting in something that's out of center in somebody else. That's it, creating balance, but it's creating balance by imbalance, if that makes sense. So again, like what you're saying is, if that victim, if I'm going to project and blame everybody else, well, if there's something that doesn't feel balanced, I have to have a part of it. I absolutely have to have a part of it. So again, it's just like exactly as you said, it's just realizing that there isn't really anybody else. It's just, okay, you've reflected something to me. Now I'm going to separate myself, find that piece in me, isolate it, work on it, balance it. And then I come back into the community again, where I won't be triggered by you and have a projection towards you. This is the responsibility and accountability of this new aeon that we're moving into, is that, if I stay entangled in you, I'm just going to keep projecting everything onto you, and then nothing is getting fixed. It just becomes conflict tennis. Whereas I need to recognize that there's an activation, separate myself, because again, I can't tell where the imbalance is in my system, at what degree, if I'm entangled in your stuff, we'll say. So it's just that separation, isolation, work on that, then come back so that I'm in a more balanced state. And then the next trigger happens, and and so on and so forth. But really just identifying that, exactly as you said, is, it's not anybody else, it's all of us. And I'm not responsible if you do your part. I'm only responsible that I have to do my part.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And this kind of idea of conflict tennis, I think, dealing with so many people these days who are just in dynamics with partners, and they're really just, playing this conflict tennis of, there's something lacking or missing inside, and they're expecting their other partner to fill it. And then if they don't, then there's anger and expectations. And it's kind of like this, what's the psychological term? Like almost like trauma bonding or codependency. It's like they're kind of stuck in this dynamic then of do. And it's really about, like you said, stepping away, working on what you have within, coming to the place like of wholeness, I suppose. I'd love for you to speak into a little bit about what it means to be a Hermetic practitioner, and maybe can you share how that kind of differentiates from, say, a shamanic practitioner, or the kind of shamanic realms, where there's probably a lot of overlap there.
Yeah. And I suppose where I'm at now is, my website really does need an update, to be quite honest. But like where I'm at now is because I'm moving into like my fourth degree initiation now, which is adeptship. So it's kind of, which is like a Western master, not ascended master, of course. I just Western master, we'll say, which is a kind of conglomeration of everything into one. So I suppose from a Hermetic practitioner point of view, what it is, you see, in Hermeticism, what Hermeticism really is you could take it as anything that has been, any wisdom that has been achieved or received, we'll say, is actually a better word, from union with the higher planes of consciousness. So that's why all religious texts are going to be Hermetic. All very ancient initiatory texts by any of the philosophers, they're all Hermetic, because anybody or any deities or anyone who has attained, the yogis, the Brahmins, the Magi texts, and any of these that you go into, are all really Hermetic, because Hermetic is really, once you go into the higher planes of consciousness, you start to understand what we consider metaphysics, I suppose. It's the conscious makeup and structure of the workings of the universe, which is where you're kind of receiving that wisdom, we'll say. And so in my understanding of Hermeticism, which is again is kind of really putting a little bit of a frame on something that's quite infinite. It allows me to understand the conscious fields and the working of it, the working of consciousness itself, basically. And obviously, as you go further and further, that gets kind of deeper, more into the entombment of your own consciousness as to how everything works. And so when I'm working with people, I suppose at that level, okay, I always use the kind of Kabbalistic tree of life it's always on hand for a little bit of an explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just one modality of understanding consciousness. There are many, and this can be used in infinite amount of ways as well, by the way. And so these are like 10 Sephiroth, which are different kind of, you could say, planes of consciousness, really. They have different essences to them, each of these little kind of circles here. And we're down here on the physical plane, and this is physical plane consciousness. And so you can see all of this is actually happening down here in the one space. But our attunement through the 5 senses externally, they pick up information, our senses. And then we process them through the mind, and our mind reflects outward and creates a reality. And that's our physical reality. But you see, once you start to kind of attune and you start to go a little bit deeper, you start to understand, and again, this is true, the understanding of Hermeticism through the experience of it, you start to become more and more attuned. And obviously, the more work you do, the more sensitized that the body gets, the more you start to master those senses in a more inward way. And also you kind of amplify other senses as well, inner senses. And you start to understand the feelings of these, because just remember, when you move beyond physicality, it's no longer objective reality. It has to become feeling. And there's the feeling, there's also the mind when they merge together, which is the merge of spirit and matter. And it creates a third separate thing, which is that Gnosis, what I'd like to call it. And so when you're working that way, is because you know, and when I say know, I don't mean know as in like the logical mind of knowing something, because that's very objective. You're talking about feelings. You're talking about a whole different kind of sensated kind of realities, basically, that you're talking about. And you're differentiating what's out of balance. And so applying the Hermetic philosophies and wisdom, or the application, which is really alchemy, is what you're doing is you're working with clients through what's out of alignment, creating their physical reality to be off center. So if someone is struggling with something in their physicality, well, I'll just know exactly what's out of play up here. Because the fact that these are out of balance will finally come down here to Yesod, which is the astral plane, which is the mirror, reflecting back into their physical reality, that exact imbalance, which is creating hassle in their lives, or trouble, or patterns that keep kind of playing out. So as a Hermetic practitioner, kind of working those planes of identifying them. And the level I work now is I can rebalance them through the way that I'll understand them and speak to a client, we'll say. But then if I'm working, we'll say, depending if I'm working in a ceremony space or something like that, I work very similar to like Zoroastrian magi, which is I would be very much attuned to. So it's kind of almost a mixture of shamanism and ceremonial magic. So kind of combining alchemy, ceremonial magic, it's again just everything morphed into the one thing. Because I know what's out of alignment, I can do practices, or I can create rituals to really amplify and deepen the realignment of those conscious fields back for a client. So it's kind of very hard to put into words. It's so vast, but it really is, I suppose, from the Hermetic side, it's an understanding. And in Hermeticism, it has to be an experience. You can't move the pieces without attuning to the experiences, so that your sensations are really kind of aligned with what you're doing. Because again, the will of the magician, it's a scientific process, but you have to know it and have it picked apart to know what you're doing, we say, to be able to kind of manage it. So that's, in a nutshell, I suppose, the workings from Hermeticism. Then obviously through shamanic work as well, because the Zoroastrian magi worked with a kind of a combination of ceremonial magic and shamanism. Because for me, shamanism is just another form of magic. I just see everything as the one thing, really. Like, it's just, the more different modalities that I apply in that make sense is the same thing. They're just different cultures, lenses of the one thing, and the way that they did it, we'll say. And so for me now, the level that I work is, it's just a conglomeration into one of kind of how I do everything, basically. But that's kind of it in a nutshell, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So well described. Yeah, and I love this idea of, shamanism as being magicians and working with these other kind of planes of consciousness, as I think or feel about it. And yeah, I think if I think of the Druids, it's like we're the magicians of Ireland. And I love this idea of Gnosis, and kind of having this wisdom through direct experience. And I see that as a kind of the shamanic path, and can extend it onto the magician's path as well, I assume, and the Hermetic path, if that's right. But I know from myself and my own journey, having been so conditioned as a scientist for, over 10 years in Trinity, and then kind of like, I want the direct experience. That's what I'm looking for. And that's the only thing that's going to change my mind as a scientist. And, those direct experiences are available to us. And you're going to touch on it there. One of the things that I love about this Gnosis and the direct experience is that you can like read books, you can intellectualize it, you can analyze it. But when you get that felt sense in the body, it's like, aha, that's when things kind of change. It's like, oh, I can no longer do that anymore because my body's saying this, or my body's pulling me towards this. And that's kind of how, I suppose, how I'm trying to lead my life. It's a lifelong practice, probably. But yeah, can you kind of
I've
speak
lost your
more
sound
into
now,
that kind
Dara.
of gnosis?
Sorry, could you just repeat that there? I lost your sound just for 2 seconds there, Dara.
Yeah, I was just going to say, could you speak more into, gnosis, and maybe how can people kind of cultivate this in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, you hit a really good point there as well about like the books and the intellectualizing things. And like, it's one thing I teach my students in my school is about that. Is like, look, we can read all the books that there is, and it helps us to gain an understanding of someone else's experience of consciousness. But we still have to have our own, because we're all wired differently. We're all colored differently, as I like to say. And so, like, your experience of that conscious sensation is going to be, you're going to describe it very, very differently than that whoever it was in a particular book. And so you have to have the experience, because otherwise you're just emulating, what somebody else had, we'll say. And we need, because we're all wired differently, to be able to comprehend in our own way. And that's how the scientific part comes in, is because when I have the experience, I apply my scientific expression to my experience, which helps me to pick it apart and understand it, through analysis, to be able to actually wield it myself, we'll say, and to have more of those experiences. But like with the Gnosis, I mean, for what I really boil it down to is like conscious embodiment. That word embodiment, again, like any word, depending on what we understand by a word, it can be any frame of finite or vastness, we'll say. But like, it really is conscious embodiment. And that's what I see is that a lot of the problems in this work, actually, in particular, that there's a lot of it in I say this work, but I suppose more in kind of spiritual fields, I'd say, is there's a lot of people fixated and attached to identities, that those attachments are kind of stopping them from actually attaining the experiences. There's a lot of people that kind of throw a lot of words around kind of quite easily, certain terms, and label themselves as certain things, and when you label yourself as a certain thing, if you haven't achieved it yet, you've kind of created the block to stop yourself from achieving it. Because if I think I've already achieved a certain, label or position or level of consciousness, and if I haven't actually achieved it, well, then I'm never going to seek it, because I think I'm already there. And the one thing that's really tricky about consciousness is, again, going back to the as above, so below, because it is fractal, it means that, this is where, when you go off the physical plane of consciousness, all you have is symbols. Words can no longer be objective to describe conscious experiences. Words have to become symbolic, which is why mystics will always talk in symbol. It's why Jesus spoke in analogy. It's not that he's trying to be confusing. He's trying to speak in a way of things that are really deep conscious understandings. And also the fact that no matter where consciousness expands to, here we are 2000 years later, we can still apply those teachings because they're symbolic. But the problem with that, I suppose, is no matter what bandwidth of consciousness that you are at, they will make sense to you at that level. But they might not be the level that they were conveyed from. And so just kind of to highlight that is one of the kind of things that I do find that kind of traps a lot of people. But like in Gnosis, what it is, I mean, first of all, like, we have the two intelligences. We have the one is the mind intelligence. So the mind intelligence is processing information, and not all just physical objective information. It can be other, non-physical information that we're receiving through this antenna as well. But then we also have the body intelligence, which is that, I suppose, what we might consider like the intuition of the body, but the sensations of the body, which has a very, very different intelligence. And you see, that's the masculine and the feminine. So the masculine, in this case, I'm talking about the body, and the feminine, we'll say more, is that the kind of high spirit that comes in. And you see, these are in all the ancient texts about the squaring of the circle, the merging of spirit and matter, the alchemical union. We have all different terms in this, but this is really what it is in order to attain this gnosis, it means that we have to be able to, first of all, expand the mind enough to be able to receive enough of this mind intelligence of information that's coming. I mean, we have different deities that we label them for these different things, like Thoth, for example. which is the logos, which is the reason of everything, not what we presume it to be, but why it was created. Very hard to kind of conceive that. Like, if you think about, we say the moon, it'll be the dimensions of the moon, the size of the moon, the rotation of the moon, the cycles, absolutely everything about it. Not because us as humans fixated a word upon it, but because that's what it naturally is contained in it, in its creation. And so that's kind of all intelligence we talk about, we say, of the mind. So it's information. And then we have the intelligence of the body, which is when this information is coming in. Does the intelligence of my body align perfectly with the information that my mind consciousness has deciphered? Because they're very, very different. Obviously, one being masculine, one being feminine. They're very, very different. And what happens with Gnosis is, and the reason I'm jumping around here a bit, but the sensitivity of the body is the one thing that gives us that intelligence. Because again, we know what this work. People tell you to trust your gut. Mm-hmm. 9 times out of 10, that is fear is in your gut, because fear comes through your gut. But intuition or Gnosis, again, if I consider Gnosis kind of a little bit deeper than intuition, it's for me, it's a very straight line, succinct, something comes through. It almost illuminates your entire body, every fiber of your body. But the body is what's receiving this from on higher. So the body has to be sensitized enough to be able to receive that signal clearly, without shadow, without misinterpretation. And so for me, getting the body is a vital, vital part. And that's removing all the density out of the human system, all the imbalances, all the wounds, which is really what the healing work is. So as we start to remove more layers of the density of who we're not, the identities, the conditioning that we have, once that removes, the body gets more sensitive. That's when we start to pick up these things that are called so-called superhuman. I mean, it's not superhuman. It's just part of the human condition. We just have to sensitize the body enough to expand the senses so that we're picking up much further into conscious realms. So then you have that intelligence of the body. The mind is also expanding into understanding much more, where you're not in that limited frame mind of what you might understand. And when they start to merge, there's this process of Gnosis. And it's very hard to describe into words because none of this is really objective. But there's just a knowing that this aligns perfectly with this, and then it births this third separate thing, which just becomes this illumination of every fiber in your entire system, and that you just know it to be true. Mm. And also be mindful when I say that we also have to be very aware of our own conditioning and shadow. And this is why the more you go further, the more trust that you build, because there's parts of ourselves that we don't know are in shadow yet, and maybe we're trying to force those things. So we need to be very, very careful about just aligning and saying something is Gnosis by, it takes a lot of work and familiarizing yourself with that process before you can start to trust it more and more and more. And I just say that as a kind of a warning, because the shadow of humanity is we always like to be someplace ahead,
kind of like that.
So I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of a bit of a roundy.
No, definitely. It's kind of like that layer of really working with the ego. And I loved this idea of working with the unconscious, the subconscious, the work of Carl Jung. I think he said, somebody asked him, was it about God? And he's like, I don't know. I know. It's like this kind of like, the deepest sense of knowing, because he went to those places. He was able to, he went so deep within, and his work is really at the forefront at the moment. A lot of people are talking about shadow work, the unconscious, archetypes, patterns, active imagination. How does I know Jung was really into symbology and symbols as well. How do symbols help us on our healing journey? And maybe can you give an example or two?
Yeah. And I mean, first of all, just to state that Jung was a mystic.
For sure. Absolutely. And on one other point as well is I got so hooked on symbols when I read the Da Vinci Code. And for me, that was kind of like my first entry into it, even though it was, quite a pop book. But I love this realm of symbols and symbology.
Yeah. We could strap in now for this one, because we could go anywhere with this. But symbols are infinite. Symbols for me are the language of consciousness. Okay, now where do we start with this night? Because it's like, again, if we talk about objective reality, okay, so we could say objective reality is physical consciousness. So we're looking at things as they physically are because they have a position in time and space. I can say the cup is here, because it's a certain place and we're at this certain time, and it's a physical thing. So we're talking about it physically. So it's not really symbolic in this case. Maybe the cup might not be the best example, but so let's just take, for example, on the material plane, this is just a cup. If you want to just take it that way, but everything has a divine spark in it. Everything has the spark of consciousness in it, and so this is the low dense of matter, we'll say. So it still has divinity in it. It still has a conscious piece to it, just like we have a conscious piece, but we have a more advanced or well, sometimes conscious state, we'll say, because we have more free will over our consciousness. This is kind of stuck in matter. But you see, this cup was created whenever the first cup was created, however far back that goes. So it was created with a conscious intention of a necessity. We need something that's going to hold a liquid or whatever. Maybe the cup comes to a point where it's going to hold something that's warm. So there's a whole process of conscious creation that's happening before that cup is ever actually physically created. And so, and this is where we're going deep into alchemy. With alchemy, we were kind of attuning to these things. I'm gone really into a long way about going this, but it'll give a good explanation, I hope. And so we can look at that cup and it could be just a cup. Or as our consciousness starts to expand a bit and we start to attune our consciousness, I can start to go beyond that. That cup could start to speak to me if I attune to it. Depending on the circumstance, whether it does stand out to me in a certain way and actually does speak to me. And it could start to give me information, because it could be, say somebody has a dream and there's a cup in the dream. Well, now I'm going into the consciousness of the cup, but in that kind of a realm, which means that, okay, it could be about you holding water, which means it could be a storing of emotions. It could be something like that. So it can open up quite vastly. So I suppose what I'm saying is, in the objective reality, things are just items. But even in the objective physical reality, there's still all the other planes of consciousness exist behind the physical. And that's where it gets symbolic, because once you go beyond that, the cup is no longer a physical thing. It's an analogy symbolically of everything consciously that could be contained within it, which is the entirety of consciousness of humanity association to a cup. And so that's just one kind of a very baseline we could say about symbols. So then when you go into like these symbols that we're going to use, we'll say. So again, once we move off the physical plane of consciousness, everything has to become symbolic, because I can no longer describe my experiences objectively for what happened for me up here. But I can only use physical words, just like when I am speaking objectively, to describe those experiences. So then words become symbolic. They have to become symbolic, because I have to use an analogy to try explain consciously what's happening to me, even though it's not exactly verbatim or exoterically what's happening. And so that's why symbols then work on two sides of the polarity. One is, if I create the symbol, I'm charging the symbol with what I intend that symbol to portray. So for example, if I want to draw, we stick with the cup because it's there, it's probably not the best example, but if I draw a cup and I want to use it as a symbol, well, I'm using the cup by exactly what I want it to mean symbolically. So let's just say I want to use it as a store of emotions, something that I'm keeping my emotions in. So that's just the expression I want it to mean. So then in the conveyance, the way that I use the word cup, if I'm writing it or whatever, or if I'm drawing it or whatever other symbols that I put in that drawing, I'm conveying it in a certain conscious expression. So basically, I'm now charging the symbol with what I want it to mean. So if you're the creator of the symbols. And so then it's going to be in that level. Then the other way is, I suppose, is receiving from symbols. So we can create the symbols by what we charge into it. And just remember, there's no right or wrong in consciousness, because everything is the one thing anyway. So whatever you believe the cup to be or whatever else to be is exactly what it is, because you have made it to be. You have charged it consciously with your willpower into it to mean that. And so then it's the same the opposite way. If I'm walking around in my physical reality, which constantly speaks to me, everything I see is speaking to me symbolically. That's just the consciousness, we'll say, that I'm attuned to. So everything is always coming to me, but I am not trying to force it. I'm not trying to look at things to make them, unless I work with a client, then it's very, very different. But let's say, for example, I go out and my car doesn't start. I'll know that's information. My car is my vehicle through life. If there's something wrong with my car, there's something stopping my flow through life. So what part of the car is not working? And I go into the deep symbolic consciousness. Okay, let's say it's the brakes are not working. Well, it's something about slowing down or maybe not going fast enough. And this is all information that is behind the physical manifestation experience. And this can sound quite out there for people, but I can tell you this is 100% consciousness is how it is. But different things, you could walk through your day, next thing you spot a fox crossing the road and it really catches your eye. Now, yesterday, maybe you've seen two foxes, but none of them really caught your eye. The fact that it caught your eye means that has some information for you. That's Your unconscious is now reverberating out a frequency that has picked up that frequency resonant because it has something relative to you, what you're going through right now. And so it really gets that information. So again, Fox for me has a lot to do about being seen. Now, this is just my personal kind of attachment to it. Sometimes you see a dead fox, something about not being seen. Maybe it's time to let the old you die and move forward into a new expression of yourself or whatever. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is you're either charging a symbol for what you want it to mean for other people, or you're having a symbol speak to you. But symbols are the language of consciousness, because in order for the symbol to be physical, it has to have all this in it as well before it ever comes to physicality. Because in the creation, from divinity downwards, it comes down this word from high etheric conscious energy, you could say. And as it comes down the tree, and it's coming more dense into physicality, we come out of the supernal triad up here, which is all about like divinity, the understanding of divinity. Then we could start to come down into more human expression down here. And then we have the mirror of Yesod, which is the moon reflects down into physicality. So anything that we create comes through this whole process. I have an idea. It's a thought. It's not very physical. That thought has to go through a whole process before it ever gets manifestation and I actually create it into something physical. So that physical thing has symbolic conscious information behind it, even though oftentimes we're not even aware of it. And so, we're always available to that information. So if I'm seeing a symbol, it's speaking to me. And that's why, like, in the world, it's so dangerous at the moment with people about symbols. Everyone is telling you what symbols mean. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Because then what you're doing is you're then following their reality and not your own. Like, people talk about a lot of, like, there's so much false esoteric wisdom that's out there because people haven't got it consciously embodied. So they tell you, like, the Freemason symbol means it's evil. They tell you that this is the Illuminati, and people don't even understand who the true Illuminati really were. But there's so much misconceptions through limited consciousness. And so what happens if someone is telling you that a particular symbol is evil, just remember every symbol has a polarity of positive and negative and everything in between, which means that then you're fixating on, we say, the negative of a symbol. You're now charging evil and negativity into the world by the programming of somebody else telling you what it means. It's not how it works. A symbol should speak to you. Sometimes it'll catch your eye. Sometimes it'll make you feel a certain way. Or sometimes it'll just show itself that you're going to do research about that symbol. And then in that breadcrumbs, it'll take you to something that will give you the next piece of information for where you go, we'll say. But that's kind of the whole thing with symbols, is because it's an expression of consciousness. And as you start to tune into your own consciousness more and more, away from the physical plane, you're going to start to have these correlations everywhere. I mean, I think Jung probably talks about the synchronicities, but it's much, much deeper than that. Even is the fact that the entire physical plane of consciousness is only a symbolic representation of what's really happening in the higher etheric fields. And so we can live our lives by matter, but it's a bit of a waste of time and it's very, arduous. Or we can start to use the material existence to guide us into alignment up here. And we can do that through symbols.
Well, yeah, absolutely love that, Peter. And I feel like, I'm just having this revelation for myself right now, is like, that's what kind of really drew me into the world of shamanism, kind of looking to nature and the elements and to the natural world for signs and symbols and clues and kind of insights. Because it's like that fox across your path and you actually catch its eye. It's like, there's something there, or something comes into a ceremony at a certain point and it's like, everyone's aware of it, that there's something there. And I never really thought about that idea of like charging the symbols with your own inner dialogue or energy. And I know these symbols hold such power, and I know that the powers that be know they hold power. I think I watched a whole documentary years ago about the Third Reich and using, the swastika, which is actually a really powerful symbol in Hinduism, turned on its side, and using the eagle and using lightning bolts and all of these kind of God-given symbols, and then using it to sway the collective unconscious to kind of back their work. So I love this idea of symbols and the power behind them.
Yeah, and I suppose just one thing with symbols as well is like there's nothing evil about a symbol. It's us. It's always that. It's like magic, right? People have this thing about dark magic and light magic. Magic is just magic. It's just a wielding of energy. It's what the human person does with it. We can choose to put it in light, or we can choose to put it in shadow. And it's the same with a symbol. Is the symbol is just the symbol, But when we charge it by what we believe it to be, that's what gives it the power. So like talking about, like we'll say, like with the Third Reich, like is they charge those symbols to have that kind of expression in them. But
Mm.
the symbol on its own is just what it is. But then I suppose you take down the conformity and conditioning of our wounds throughout ancestrally, we still linger with the same conscious expression of those symbols, because that's what happens until we kind of heal and bring everything back into balance as well. So yeah, so symbols get a bad name sometimes, but it's not really the symbols. It's just our own unconscious interpretation, we'll say.
Yeah, it's like the idea of the dollar, the dollar bill, and I've watched many videos on the symbology of all that, and the evil eye and the Illuminati, and it's kind of like, well, is that making me more scared of having more money? I don't know. Yeah, so yeah, coming towards the end, I have really enjoyed the conversation. I can't believe we're at an hour mark already. I wanted
That's
to
the
want to chat about so much more. But yeah, maybe to kind of wrap up with, how do you think these kind of ancient mystery schools and these kind of the kind of mythological wisdom, which is, I feel, is having a big moment again, especially in the men's movement as well. This kind of mythopoetic movement is kicking through again. It kicked through in the 80s, now it's kicking through again. How do you think we can look to mythology, symbols, these ancient mystery schools to kind of give us a pathway forward for this kind of global awakening, kind of trying to circle back in, global awakening or initiation that we're on right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the one thing about like mythology is it is our guide, it is our guide. And I mean, like mythology as well, just remember, like everything really is mythology. Anything that comes from a true, authentic baseline is a mythology. And for me, I suppose what I understand about a mythology is a story of what we will face in our human experience, but time and time again through these varying cycles. Like the time period that we're in might change. That's why consciousness always has to be left malleable, has to have room to breathe. Because as humanity evolves, because it's all consciousness, we're all part of the one consciousness. So consciousness is constantly evolving. We have to be able to make room to evolve with it. And so the mythologies are told in a way that obviously through this kind of archaic and symbolic expression, we'll say, which is so that it will last through time. And the thing is, like, when you open them up, and this is the one thing about whenever you're working with consciousness or wherever you're working, especially with symbols, is you never keep them rigid. Never, ever keep them rigid. You have to give them room to breathe. And so, like, don't fixate on the surface level of the story because maybe it happened, whatever, 10,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago. You have to take the conscious expression and see how that would show up on the surface in the material plane in today's world. So we talk about, like, I mean, let's just touch on the bits of it, like, like say the Greek mythology, like we talk about Perseus, and nearly all the heroes were half man, half God. So that teaches us that we are man with this divine spark that we need to cultivate in our evolutionary process to attain our divinity, basically. So it teaches us that's to never forget that we are here to expand into our godliness, basically, into our divinity. That yes, we are human, having a human experience, but our consciousness is divine. So we need to break out the consciousness out of the physical prison, basically. So it teaches us that. So that's going to be always existent in humanity. Then you have the different challenges, which again, from an esoteric point of view, every story can be opened up in infinite amount of ways, which are all really relevant and which will show themselves to you at any given time by where you're at. Again, letting the symbols speak to me. So I read the mythology today and maybe it speaks to me this side of the story because this is what I'm going through. Maybe Medusa with the stone head, and I need the mirrors because I need the mirror to look at my own reflection in order to slay that beast. And that, and that's maybe where I'm at today. I could read it tomorrow and I could get maybe a little different nugget of it because that's where I am tomorrow. But I mean, I suppose mythology is that malleable story that always has room to breathe relative to the position in time in our own evolution where we're at. So not to keep it rigid. And it is a guide. And I mean, religion is a mythology. Some people might not like the fact that I say that, but it is. It's not taking from the physical happenings of what a religion was founded on. But if you take, again, let's just take the story of Yeshua into the Christ. Like, we're at a very, very different time in humanity right now. So to fixate on the very physical story of the Christ or towards the Christ is not really going to be relative today. Time is different. But at the conscious level of what was happening through each step of that journey is happening to us right now. But we lose the message if we create it rigid about the exact same story, read it exoterically on the surface, make it rigid, make it verbatim. Then it becomes something that we can't fit into. It doesn't have the room for our consciousness to fit back into it. But when you take it as a mythology, it has room to breathe and it has room to grow into today's world. And I mean, if you think about mythology as well, like mythology has always been added to. The core baseline is your deities and what they represent, right? So there's your archetypes. But even take the likes of Homer or many of the initiates who kind of writ their own little additions to it in their own poetry and their own expressions, is they added in new pieces or new mythologies using the same deities, and it still works. Is because as we've evolved into their time, they express through the same language and the same deities and the same archetypes, but adding in the stories. And so, because it comes from an authentic place, and that's the most important thing, once it comes from an authentic place, then the consciousness will always be able to be received from it. Because authenticity would just means that the conscious expression beneath the physical words expressed authentically will be able to grow and expand and show themselves even at further times in humanity. I mean, even when I write myself, like my own poetry is very, very esoteric. Like I use a lot of symbolism. And the reason I use symbolism is because even though I'm writing my personal story, and I can be very, very raw with my story, but I'm not writing, hey, I walked over here and I went there. I'm expressing just in that conscious level, which means that when you read it, you don't get my story, you get your own. Because it just has that level. And that is what a mythology basically is well, for me anyway, that's my take on mythology. Other people might have a different perception, but it is just that story that we follow, because just remember, consciousness is cyclical. And so the mythology teaches us the challenges that we're going to face as humans in order to go from man into divinity as a means of like transferring or expanding our consciousness from physical plane consciousness as we go towards, because that's the evolutionary process. We're all going to go there. It just depends on how long it takes us to go there. And we're talking about vast periods of time here as well, by the way, just to be really, really clear. But the mythology is, what did they learn before us? They cultivated, marked it in stone in the stories that could be told forward, so that we can learn from the mistakes of our ancestors and apply it to make life a little bit easier as we traverse this process of growth and expansion.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible and amazing. And yeah, I love working with the archetypal energies, and even with the masculine ones, and even seeing in Ireland now this kind of big revival of connecting back to our own mythologies, our own deities, the Dagda and the Morrigan, and and connecting to the old stories and fables. And I think we're in for an exciting few years ahead, or thousands of years, as you maybe put it. I think we're gonna wrap up there, Peter. We're just coming up to the quarter past the hour. Is there anything you'd like to share before we finish, and then maybe you can let us know where people can find you? I'll have everything in the notes anyway, but any closing remarks?
Nothing too out there, I think. But I think just for people just to kind of maybe take a step back every now and again. We're in very, very chaotic times. It is a death process, and I don't mean that death in a fearful way. I just mean a symbolic death. We are in a very necessary death process. Things are chaotic out there. Just try not to get consumed into it. I always like to say to people, in your mind, take 3 steps back, come to the breath, and just focus on you. If you want that to change out there, to stop it affecting you, you just have to work on yourself. And you're just starting, one grain of sand on a beach, and the next person is the next person. Eventually the whole beach is there, and reality will change into a better place.
Thank you, Peter. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, all that you've learned. And thank you for your presence and time. Where can people find out about your work or what's coming up next for you?
So Instagram is probably the best place to kind of come across me. I think I must update my website, but Instagram, it's at subconsciously.conscious. My website then is just peterkelly.online. I need to update that. And Facebook, I think I'm just under Subconsciously Conscious as well. I have a YouTube channel, Subconsciously Conscious, which I kind of need to do something with, to be quite honest, which is one of the many things that I do plan on starting to get something kind of moving on as well eventually. So we will, but they're kind of the main places really. I suppose what I have coming up is I have the launch of my second semester of my Ancient Mystery School. And this will be the Temple of Horus, which is launching on June 26th. So that's a 12-month commitment to a school, which is basically like a broad as the Ancient Mystery Schools, but in today's time for the expansion of consciousness, for tuning into the soul level. I have an alchemy retreat coming up in the middle of September, I think around the 20th of September or something, in Wicklow, which is kind of a 2-day residential retreat. I have an astral healing ceremony, which is just a 1-day ceremony coming up as well. Then in the 5th of July, I think. I'm up in Belfast this weekend actually for healing of the masculine as well, but probably be kind of too soon before this is released. But yeah, that and just the one-to-one work. So I mean, yeah, it is constantly. There's just so much happening at the moment. I've kind of been in my cave for probably the last 2 years, so I'm only starting to come back out and do workshops and retreats again. So yeah, so you can just find me in any of those places. Probably the best thing I'd say. And
Great.
thanks again for having us on, Dar. I really, really appreciate it. Always good to chat about these things and where things are going with us all. And yeah, it's always exciting.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's very exciting. I think we're living in, wonderful times. We have access to, great teachers like yourself, many other great teachers in the world, knowledge at our fingertips. And yeah, thank you again for being here. And to all you, if you're still listening at this point, well done. You made it this far. What did you think about this episode? Maybe you can drop your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to share it around to those who might enjoy, find benefit from it. And thank you all so much for listening, and looking forward to chatting to my next guest on the next podcast. Take care and be well.